Most people think getting married is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. For me, it was the day I became unemployed, homeless, and technically disowned before the wedding cake was even served. I grew up as the only son of one of the wealthiest CEOs in the Orion Trade Alliance. My father controlled shipping fleets, manufacturing worlds, and enough corporations to make entire planetary governments nervous. Since childhood, everyone assumed my future had already been planned. I would inherit part of the company. I would marry someone from another wealthy family. I would spend the rest of my life attending corporate galas and pretending quarterly reports were exciting. Then I met her. She came from a small agricultural colony near the outer systems. She wasn't rich. She wasn't politically connected. She didn't own a single corporation. What she did have was a sense of humor that could destroy my ego in under 30 seconds. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours. Our second lasted 6. By the third date, I was already imagining a future that didn't involve boardrooms or shareholders. Naturally, my father hated her. The moment he learned she wasn't from a powerful family, he treated the relationship like a temporary illness. "You'll come to your senses," he kept saying. I didn't. Every attempt to separate us only pushed us closer together. When I proposed, she laughed for a full minute before saying yes. Not because she didn't want to marry me. Because she thought I was joking. Apparently, dropping to one knee while accidentally stepping on your own jacket doesn't create the most romantic atmosphere. Still, she said yes. For months my father tried everything. Bribes. Threats. Lectures. PowerPoint presentations. I wish I were kidding about the presentations. Nothing worked. So eventually he stopped arguing. That should have worried me. Instead, I assumed he'd finally accepted reality. I was wrong. The wedding itself was beautiful. The ceremony took place beneath glowing crystal trees imported from her homeworld. Friends and family filled the venue. Music echoed through the gardens. For a few hours, everything felt perfect. Then my father stood up during the reception. Anyone who knew him recognized that expression immediately. The same expression he used before firing executives. The room became silent. He raised his glass. "I would like to congratulate the newlyweds," he announced. A few guests clapped nervously. Then he smiled. That was when I knew disaster was coming. "Since my son has chosen love over responsibility, I have decided to support his decision completely." The room relaxed. For approximately 3 seconds. "Effective immediately, he is removed from all family trusts, corporate positions, inheritance agreements, and financial accounts." The silence that followed was almost impressive. One guest actually dropped a fork. My father continued like he was reading quarterly earnings. "The apartment belongs to the company. The vehicles belong to the company. His executive access is revoked. He is now entirely independent." My new wife slowly turned toward me. "Did your father just fire you at our wedding?" "Technically, yes. That's honestly kind of impressive." Several guests looked horrified. One wealthy socialite grabbed her husband's arm and whispered, "Can they do that?" My wife overheard her. "I don't know," she said. "I've never attended a public execution before." I nearly laughed despite everything. My father clearly expected panic. Instead, she reached for my hand. That simple gesture mattered more than every credit I'd ever inherited. The reception continued awkwardly while rumors spread through the crowd. Some guests left early. Others avoided eye contact. A few looked at us like we had contracted a rare disease called poverty. By the end of the night, my father approached one final time. His voice lowered. "You'll be back within a month." I shook my head. "No. 2 months then." Still no. He glanced toward my wife. "This marriage won't survive real hardship." For the first time, she answered before I could. "Maybe," she said cheerfully. "But if it fails, at least we'll save money on anniversary gifts." I had never seen anyone confuse my father before. The expression on his face was worth every lost credit. A few hours later, we left the venue carrying only a handful of bags. No inheritance. No corporate title. No safety net. Just the two of us. As our transport disappeared into the city lights, I looked at the woman beside me and wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. She squeezed my hand and smiled. Strangely enough, for the first time in years, I felt completely free. The first week of being poor was educational. The second week was humiliating. By the third week, I was actively negotiating with household appliances. I had spent my entire life surrounded by assistants, automated systems, and services that handled every inconvenience before I even noticed it existed. Suddenly I found myself standing in a tiny apartment kitchen staring at a smoke detector that seemed personally offended by my cooking. "I followed the recipe exactly," I argued. My wife looked into the frying pan. "The recipe didn't say to burn it." I interpreted creatively. "That's not how food works." The apartment itself was smaller than my childhood bedroom. Every morning involved a complicated dance to avoid bumping into furniture. Every month involved carefully calculating expenses instead of casually buying things because they looked interesting. Oddly enough, I loved it. Not the budgeting part. That was terrible. But for the first time in my life, people weren't treating me like a future CEO. They treated me like a normal person. Even better, every challenge brought my wife and me closer together. We learned together. Failed together. Laughed together. One evening we sat on the apartment floor eating inexpensive takeout while reviewing our finances. The numbers weren't encouraging. My wife studied the budget and sighed dramatically. "We have enough money for food." "Good." "And rent." "Excellent." "And approximately 3 emergency noodles." "That seems low." "We'll have to be careful." I nodded seriously. Then we both burst out laughing. For some reason, life felt simpler than it ever had inside my father's empire. A few days later, my wife suggested visiting her grandmother. I had met the elderly woman only once during our engagement. She seemed sweet. Quiet. Polite. The sort of grandmother who baked desserts and worried if everyone was eating enough vegetables. I couldn't have been more wrong. We arrived at her small countryside home just before sunset. The 80-year-old alien greeted us warmly and immediately began feeding us enough food to supply a military outpost. As we ate, she asked about married life. Then she asked about our finances. Then she asked about my father. What followed was less a conversation and more an interrogation. "How many subsidiaries does he control?" I blinked. "Several hundred." "What percentage are logistics-based?" "I don't know." She frowned. "You should know." A few minutes later she was asking about supply chains, shipping contracts, executive turnover rates, and procurement systems. I looked at my wife. My wife looked back. Neither of us had any idea what was happening. Finally the grandmother folded her hands. "So your father publicly humiliated my granddaughter's husband?" The room suddenly felt colder. "Well, yes. And he expected your marriage to fail. Basically." She nodded slowly. "I see." For several long seconds nobody spoke. Then the elderly woman stood up and disappeared into another room. I assumed she needed tea. Instead she returned carrying several data tablets. She placed them on the table. The devices were old. The information stored inside them was not. Corporate records. Business plans. Acquisition reports. Investment portfolios. My eyes widened. "What is all this?" "My career." I stared. "What career?" She looked genuinely confused. "The one before retirement." My wife nearly dropped her drink. Apparently even she hadn't heard this story before. The grandmother sighed. "I founded 4 major companies." "What?" "Sold 3. "What?" "Hostile takeover on the 4th. "What?" She patted my shoulder. "You say what quite a lot." I wasn't sure what other response was appropriate. This sweet little grandmother had casually revealed a business history more impressive than most CEOs could dream of. Suddenly dozens of things made sense. The confidence. The sharp questions. The terrifyingly calm expression. She wasn't a retired grandmother. She was a retired predator. The grandmother continued reviewing information on one of the tablets. Your father made a mistake. I laughed nervously. Several, probably. No. One very specific mistake. She pointed at me. He underestimated a human. Then she pointed at my wife. And he insulted my granddaughter. Something dangerous appeared in her smile. The kind of smile generals probably see right before losing wars. My wife leaned forward. What are you thinking? The grandmother's eyes sparkled. I'm thinking your father needs a lesson. I relaxed slightly. Maybe she meant a strongly worded message. Perhaps a public criticism. A legal complaint. Something reasonable. Then she opened a market analysis report covering 3 entire star systems. My relaxation disappeared immediately. What exactly are you planning? The grandmother smiled. Oh, nothing dramatic. She zoomed in on several of my father's largest corporate clients. I'm only going to build a company. I blinked. A company? A better company. My wife started laughing. I started worrying. For the next hour, the grandmother explained strategies, market opportunities, and weaknesses hidden inside my father's empire. The scary part wasn't that she had a plan. The scary part was how detailed it already was. When she finally finished, she looked at me. Are you willing to work hard? Yes. Learn quickly? Yes. Ignore conventional wisdom? Probably. Good. She nodded with satisfaction. Then she delivered a sentence that would completely change my life. Tomorrow morning, we're going to create your future. And somehow, that sounded much more dangerous than being disowned. The next morning began at 6 o'clock. Apparently, successful business empires are not built by sleeping until noon. This was unfortunate news. I arrived at my wife's grandmother's house carrying coffee and optimism. By lunchtime, both were gone. The elderly woman immediately transformed our dining room into a command center. Data screens covered every available surface. Market reports floated in the air. Financial projections rotated above the table. For someone officially retired, she worked with the energy of a person trying to conquer a small moon. Your father's company is large, she explained. Very large. Which means it's slow. I nodded. That sounds logical. It's also vulnerable. That part sounded considerably more interesting. Over the following weeks, she taught me more about business than I'd learned during years inside my father's corporation. My father had always trained executives. The grandmother trained survivors. Every lesson focused on solving problems instead of protecting profits. Every strategy emphasized adaptability. Whenever I proposed something complicated, she simplified it. Whenever I worried about tradition, she ignored it. And whenever I made excuses, she threatened to assign me additional spreadsheets. The woman was terrifying. Fortunately, my wife enjoyed every second of it. At night, the 3 of us would sit together reviewing plans while eating inexpensive meals. Sometimes my wife would rest her head on my shoulder while we worked. Those moments reminded me exactly why I had chosen this life. I had lost wealth. I had gained a partner. That felt like a fair trade. Within a month, we officially launched our company. Calling it an office required imagination. The building was small. The furniture was mismatched. The coffee machine occasionally produced liquids that violated several scientific principles. Still, it was ours. Our first employees weren't corporate superstars. They were talented people overlooked by larger companies. One former engineer. One logistics specialist. One accountant who openly described herself as professionally argumentative. The grandmother hired them all. When I questioned her choices, she shrugged. I don't need obedient employees. What do you need? People willing to tell you when you're wrong. The accountant immediately raised her hand. You are wrong about at least 3 things already. The grandmother smiled proudly. Excellent. Our first major contract arrived completely by accident. I was presenting a proposal to a potential client when a presentation screen malfunctioned. Half my prepared material disappeared. Instead of delivering a polished corporate speech, I spent 20 minutes honestly discussing how we would solve their problems. The client loved it. Apparently, sincerity was refreshing after decades of executive jargon. The contract wasn't huge, but it was enough. A week later, another followed. Then another. Then 3 more. The company began growing faster than anyone expected. Especially me. Every victory felt surreal. The engineer improved delivery systems. The accountant terrified competitors. The logistics specialist somehow knew everyone in the industry. And the grandmother quietly guided everything from behind the scenes. Whenever challenges appeared, she already had solutions. Whenever competitors attacked, she predicted their moves days in advance. I eventually stopped asking how. Some mysteries are safer unexplored. 2 months after launch, industry publications started noticing us. 3 months after launch, investors started calling. 4 months after launch, larger corporations began taking us seriously. That was also the moment my father finally noticed. At first, he dismissed us. I knew because one of his former executives told me. Apparently, his exact words had been, "My son is running a hobby, not a company." The grandmother laughed for nearly 10 minutes after hearing that. "Good," she said. "Good? I prefer arrogant opponents." The real surprise came when we reviewed our newest contracts. Several clients had previously worked with my father's corporation. Not all of them, but enough to attract attention. The grandmother wasn't targeting his empire directly. She was simply offering better service, better prices, better communication. As it turned out, many customers appreciated being treated like people instead of account numbers. Who knew? One evening, while reviewing financial reports, I noticed something strange. We had just secured another major client. One of my father's oldest. I stared at the numbers. Then I looked at my wife. Then at the grandmother. "Is it just me?" I asked. "Or are we stealing his customers?" The grandmother didn't even look up from her tablet. "Stealing implies they belong to him." That answer was somehow more intimidating than a direct confession. By the 5th month, our tiny startup had become one of the fastest growing companies in the sector. Employees were joining every week. Revenue kept increasing. Industry analysts couldn't explain our success. The funny part was that neither could I. I simply worked hard, listened to smart people, and tried not to ruin everything. Meanwhile, my father grew increasingly obsessed with defeating us. He launched new marketing campaigns, reduced prices, offered incentives. Nothing seemed to work. Every move he made felt reactive. Every move we made felt deliberate. One night, as I locked up the office, my wife wrapped her arms around me and smiled. "Remember when we were worried about paying rent?" I laughed. "Remember when I nearly burned down the apartment making dinner? You nearly burned down the neighborhood." "That's a slight exaggeration." She kissed my cheek. Then we looked through the office windows at the growing company we had built together. For the first time, I realized something important. My father had spent years preparing me to inherit success. But losing everything had forced me to learn how to create it. And somewhere across the city, whether he realized it or not, he was about to face the most expensive mistake of his entire career. Exactly 6 months after my wedding, I found myself standing inside the largest business convention center in the sector. The irony wasn't lost on me. Half a year earlier, I had walked out of my wedding with a few bags and no inheritance. Now reporters were asking for interviews. Life is strange. The annual corporate summit was one of the biggest events in the industry. Executives, investors, analysts, and media representatives gathered from across multiple star systems. For decades, my father had been one of the event's biggest attractions. This year things were different. Everywhere I looked, people were talking about our company. Questions followed us through every hallway. Requests for meetings filled our schedule. Even the investors who had ignored us months earlier suddenly acted like lifelong friends. Apparently, success has a magical effect on memory. My wife found the whole situation hilarious. Remember when nobody returned our calls? I nodded. Now they're returning them before we make them. She laughed. Progress. The funniest part was watching my father realize what was happening. I spotted him across the convention floor surrounded by executives. For the first time in my life, he looked uncomfortable. Not because his company was failing. It was still enormous. Still powerful. Still profitable. The problem was that every major conversation eventually drifted back to us. Our growth. Our innovation. Our customer satisfaction. Our future plans. The startup he had dismissed as a hobby had become the headline of the event. The grandmother enjoyed every second. She spent most of the morning wandering around the convention center while carrying a cup of tea and quietly terrifying executives. Several people recognized her. That surprised me. Apparently her reputation hadn't disappeared during retirement. One investor actually turned pale when she introduced herself. After he hurried away, I asked what happened. She shrugged. I may have acquired his company once. Acquired? Hostile takeover. You say that like people say good morning. She smiled. It was a productive decade. By afternoon, the main conference hall was packed. Awards were being announced. Industry achievements were being celebrated. Then came the biggest surprise. Our company received recognition as one of the fastest-growing organizations in the sector. The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. My wife squeezed my hand. For a moment, I remembered our tiny apartment. The endless budgeting. The uncertainty. The fear. Every difficult day suddenly felt worthwhile. As we stepped off the stage, I heard a familiar voice. You've done well. I turned around. My father stood there. For several seconds neither of us spoke. This was the confrontation everyone expected. The dramatic showdown. The final argument. Instead, I felt strangely calm. 6 months earlier I would have desperately wanted his approval. Now I didn't need it. I heard you've been busy, I said. His expression tightened. You took several important clients. You mean the clients who voluntarily signed contracts? That answer didn't improve his mood. For the first time, I noticed something unexpected. He looked tired. Not defeated. Just tired. After a long silence, he shook his head. I thought you'd fail. I know. I was certain. I know. His gaze shifted toward my wife. Then toward the grandmother. The grandmother smiled politely. That somehow looked more threatening than open hostility. My father sighed. I don't understand how this happened. The grandmother answered before I could. That's because you were studying balance sheets. He frowned. What does that mean? It means you measured assets and ignored people. The old woman took a sip of tea. You saw a spoiled heir. She pointed toward me. I saw someone willing to learn. Then she pointed toward my wife. You saw a poor colony girl. My wife grinned. I am pretty poor. The grandmother ignored the interruption. I saw loyalty. Finally, she pointed directly at my father. And that's why you're standing here confused. The surrounding silence was magnificent. Several nearby executives suddenly became very interested in listening. My father slowly looked around. The reporters. The investors. The clients. The successful companies standing in front of him. Then realization finally arrived. By trying to teach me a lesson, he had accidentally forced me to build my own future. By cutting me off, he had removed the safety net that kept me dependent. And by insulting my wife's family, he had unknowingly declared war on the most dangerous grandmother in the galaxy. The expression on his face was priceless. My wife nearly burst out laughing. To his credit, my father eventually smiled. A small one. But genuine. Perhaps, he admitted, I made a mistake. The grandmother nodded. Your first correct business decision all year. I had to look away to avoid laughing. Even my father couldn't argue with that. Later that evening, my wife and I stood outside the convention center watching ships cross the night sky. The city lights stretched endlessly below us. 6 months. That was all it had taken. 6 months to lose everything. 6 months to discover who I actually was. 6 months to build something that belonged to us. My wife leaned against my shoulder. Any regrets? I thought about the inheritance, the luxury apartment, the corporate title. Then I thought about the journey, the struggles, the victories, the woman beside me. Not one. She smiled and kissed me. Behind us, the convention doors opened. The grandmother emerged carrying another stack of business proposals. Excellent, she announced. We exchanged worried looks. What's excellent? I asked. She grinned. I just identified 3 more corporations that need better management. My wife laughed. I groaned. The grandmother marched toward the waiting transport like a general preparing another campaign. Watching her go, I finally understood an important truth. My father might have been the richest CEO in the sector, but my wife's grandmother was the reason entire industries slept with one eye open. And somehow, I was lucky enough to be on her side.